Hello, my name is Philippe Girard, a professor in the history department at McNeese State University.
And I'm Kealy Trevino. I'm a history student at McNeese. Welcome to Your Grandma Rocks, where we explore the lives of famous women in history.
Welcome and bienvenue à nos amis francophones. Vous écoutez la radio de l'Université McNeese.
On the program today, music and history, as we retrace the life of a remarkable woman.
She was a singer, a dancer, a civil rights leader.
She earned a lot of money and lost it all.
She even fought Nazis.
The name of this Wonder Woman was
Josephine Baker.
Along the way, we'll sample a few songs, including some of hers, of course. By the way, how did you get interested in her life, Dr. Girard?
Well, her life is amazing, so for many years, she has been on my short list of potential topics for the show. But in the past few months, she really seemed to pop up everywhere in my life. Last July, I was visiting family in France, and I happened to visit the castle of Milan, which, as it turned out, is where she lived a good deal of her life. And then a couple of weeks ago, the French president announced that he would put her in the Pantheon, which is the biggest honor that France can bestow upon you. And finally, just last weekend, the Banners program at McNeese staged not one, but two shows about Josephine Baker. A burlesque show about her dancing career, and a more traditional play about her friendship with Grace Kelly. So at that point, I figured I have no choice. The universe wants me to do a show about her. And actually, there was one last omen, because a couple weeks ago, a student in my French history class selected Josephine Baker for her oral presentation. And that student would be you. So what piqued your interest?
Well, that first day in class, when you were talking about famous people in French history, she really just stood out to me. She was just an ordinary girl from Missouri trying to make ends meet. And so I just wanted to learn more about her life.
So, all right, now that we got that out of the way, let's see if you have done your homework. So where and when was Josephine Baker born?
She was born Frida Josephine McDonald in St. Louis, Missouri in 1906.
Probably not the best time and place for a black woman to grow up, I must say. Just to give you an idea, one of the worst race riots in the U.S. took place in East St. Louis in 1917. Between 39 and 150 African Americans were lynched by a white mob. That's the kind of world that Josephine Baker grew up in.
Her dad quickly dropped out of the picture, which didn't help either. So young Josephine was poor, and she worked as a maid to make ends meet. So
she was destined for the typical life of a black woman of her time, the kind portrayed in the novel The Help.
Except Josephine Baker was anything but typical. In 1920, at age 13, she dropped out of high school to marry her first husband, Willie Wells. Then a year later, she divorced him to marry her second husband, Willie Baker.
So she went from one Willie to another then. Okay, sorry, I couldn't help myself.
All jokes aside, her love life was complicated, but we'll get back to that later. She was also a talented singer and dancer, so by age 16, she dumped her second husband and headed to New York to try her luck there.
So I'm sensing two themes here. First, we're dealing with a woman who was willing to be proactive to change her fate. And second, she had no future in Missouri, so she had to exile herself to places that were less prejudiced.
She exiled herself twice, actually. In New York, a promoter offered her $250 a week to be part of a show, but only if she agreed to move to Paris, and also if she agreed to dance in the nude. So she uprooted herself yet again and crossed the Atlantic.
And France became her second homeland. In fact, her iconic song is precisely about that dual allegiance. J'ai deux amours, mon pays et Paris.
Which means I have two loves, my country and Paris. We gotta listen to it.
We do. So let's take our first musical break now. Here's a song, J'ai deux amours, as sung by Josephine Baker.
Au-delà des mers, là-bas sur le ciel clair, il existe une cité au séjour enchanté. Et sur les grands arbres noirs, chaque soir, vers elle s'en va tout mon espoir. J'ai deux amours, mon pays et Paris, pareil toujours. Paris. Ce qui m'ensorcelle, c'est Paris, Paris, tout entier. Le voir un jour, j'ai deux amours, mon pays.
Bonjour and welcome back to Your Grammar Rocks. We just listened to J'ai deux amours by Josephine Baker. Je m'appelle Philippe Girard.
And I'm Kealy Trevino. Today we're exploring the life of African-American singer and dancer Josephine Baker. Before our break, we saw how she escaped a life of prejudice and poverty to try her luck in Paris. And I'm talking about Paris in the Roaring 20s.
Yep, in fact, you could call her a flapper. She was a sexually liberated, fashionable woman of the 20s. She fits the bill.
All right, that's where we get to the show that made her famous.
The one with the bananas.
Yes, I must say, I felt a bit weird when I went on YouTube and typed Josephine Baker banana dance. Basically, she was doing mock African dances in the middle of the jungle, wearing little more than a banana skirt and a bra.
And the clip you saw on YouTube was actually tamer than the real deal, because that was a cleaned up version that was shown in movie theaters, and that's why the video has survived. The live version on the stage, that was even racier. Aside from that skimpy banana skirt, she was pretty much naked on stage.
I know all of that took place 100 years ago, but still, I had a hard time watching it.
I know what you mean. As I mentioned earlier, last weekend I went to see Josephine, a burlesque show, and I was really wondering how they would deal with that particular dance. On the one hand, you cannot skip the banana dance altogether because, well, that's what launched her career in the 20s. That's the one thing that people know about her. But then asking a black woman to dance half naked in a banana skirt in 2021, that's a bit, shall we say, problematic.
I couldn't go see the show because I was working that night. So tell me, how did they handle it?
Well, they went full Josephine. The lead actress was wearing the skirt and she was half naked. No apologies.
So basically, the liberals in the audience were mad because of the racial insensitivity, and the religious conservatives were mad because of the nudity.
Boobs and bananas. Double threat.
What about you? What did you think of it all?
Well, I am a full-grown man, so I have seen breasts before, and that part didn't bother me. But I lean on the liberal side, and I study racial relations for a living, so the banana part definitely felt weird. But overall, as a historian, I appreciated the brutal honesty of the staging and how that show tackled the past head-on. And I want to give a special shout-out to the lead actress, Tamisha Harris, because really that took a lot of courage for her to play every part of the career of Josephine Baker. I also happened to bump into her at the restaurant of the show, and she's a delightful person in person. So the key question for us now, getting back to the narrative, is how did Josephine Baker herself use the show? Did she roll her eyes and say, here we go again, those racist French producers of the 20s want me to dance like a savage?
Actually, she viewed the dance quite positively. Remember how she left a country where black people were routinely lynched by a mob? So Paris was a breath of fresh air by comparison, even if she had to do the banana dance. Here's a quote by her. "One day I realized I lived in a country where I was afraid to be black. It was suffocating. I felt liberated in France."
To be 100% honest, France was not exactly an anti-racist paradise either. France had a huge colonial empire in Africa in the 1920s. We'll get to that in our class. And supposedly because France had a duty to quote-unquote civilize barbaric savages in the tropics. But I guess by comparison, racism in France was not quite as strong as it was in the US, especially in a cosmopolitan city like Paris.
The 1920s in Paris were also a time of fascination with African culture, things like jazz and African masks.
Yeah, so in a way, Josephine Baker used this fad for the exoticism of the tropics, as well as a fetish that Parisian men had for naked African women, as a way to suit her purposes and launch her career.
And it worked. Ernest Hemingway, Pablo Picasso, and all the great writers and artists in Paris were smitten with her.
You could say that she reappropriated racist cliches to strip them of their power, starting with a banana skirt.
What's up with bananas, by the way? Carmen Miranda was doing a similar skit in the U.S. with a banana hat.
Well, Sigmund Freud might have a thing or two to say about man's fascination with bananas, but you'll have to listen to the show that I did on Carmen Miranda for the answer to your question.
Will do. But back to our topic. Did Josephine Baker star in movies too, like Carmen Miranda?
Well, she did a few, but these were not huge hits. She really was a star of the music hall. Singing, dancing on the stage, that was the heart of her career.
What about her love life? We've seen her go through a few husbands and lovers already.
Well, after those two husbands, there was Pepito, who was her manager and lover for many years. And then in 1937, she married again to Jean Lyon, who was a Jewish businessman.
1937, not a good year to be a Jew in Europe. You forgot her most famous lover, the Mexican painter Frida Kahlo.
You're correct. Josephine Baker was bisexual. She and Frida Kahlo hooked up when the painter was doing an exhibit of her work in Paris. And you have to check out the other show we also did on Frida Kahlo in order to get all the juicy details.
You should be a used car salesman. You're really good at pitching shows.
I'll consider that if my career as a college professor does not pan out in the end. But let's take a break now. Since we just mentioned Frida Kahlo, let's listen to my favorite Spanish language love song of all times. Here's La Historia de un Amor, sung by Libertad Lamarque.
Ya no estás más a mi lado, corazón. En el alma solo tengo soledad. Y si ya no puedo verte, porque Dios me hizo quererte para hacerme sufrir más. Siempre fuiste la razón de mi existir. Adorarte para mí fue religión. Y en tus besos yo encontraba el amor que me brindaba, el calor de tu pasión. Es la historia de un amor como no habrá otro igual, que me hizo comprender todo el bien, todo el mal, que le dio luz a mi vida, apagándola después. ¡Ay, qué noche tan oscura! Todo se me ha de volver. Ya no estás más a mi lado, corazón. En el alma solo tengo soledad. Y si ya no puedo verte, porque Dios me hizo quererte para hacerme sufrir más. La historia de un amor como no habrá otro igual, que me hizo comprender todo el bien, todo el mal, que le dio luz a mi vida, apagándola después. ¡Ay, qué noche tan oscura! Todo se me ha de volver. Ya no estás más a mi lado, corazón. En el alma solo tengo soledad. Y si ya no puedo verte, porque Dios me hizo quererte para hacerme sufrir más.
Welcome back. I'm Kealy Trevino, co-host of Your Grandma Rocks, your favorite women's history show on KBYS.
Et je suis Philippe Girard. Vous écoutez la radio de l'Université McNeese.
Today we're exploring the life of the American performer Josephine Baker.
American and French, because when she married Jean Lyon, the businessman, in 1937, she acquired French citizenship by marriage.
That husband was Jewish, which was another daring choice by Josephine Baker because anti-Semitism was strong in the 30s and World War II was just around the corner.
In fact, for Josephine Baker, World War II was the most exciting part of her life that was already far from boring.
Right. She did all she could to help her adopted country. She sang for French soldiers at the front and raised funds for the Red Cross. Then, when the Nazis invaded France in 1940, she joined the resistance.
And that was another daring choice. Let's just pause for a second and ponder the fact that she was a black woman, married to a Jewish man, living under Nazi occupation. The safe choice would have been to lie low, not to join the resistance.
You're right, she didn't lie low. She continued to perform all over Europe and North Africa, which gave her a chance to spy on the Germans and pass secret messages for the resistance. She hid some of these messages in the lyrics of her music sheets or even in her bra.
The show I mentioned earlier had a good line. They said, "Who would ever think of strip searching the exhibitionist?"
For her role during the war, she received a bunch of medals from the French government. She was a genuine war hero. Then after the war, she bought a castle in the southwest of France.
And that would be the castle of Milan, which I visited this summer. It's definitely worth a detour. It's a beautiful medieval castle in the Périgord region of France. And of course, now they have a big exhibit in the castle on the life of Josephine Baker.
She called it Sleeping Beauty's Castle. Again, for a black girl coming from St. Louis, becoming a princess was not a given. She wasn't born a princess, she became one through her sheer will.
By then, she was married to yet another husband. His name was Jo Bouillon. And for those keeping count at home, that would have been husband number 4.
Josephine dreamt of having kids, but she couldn't, so she decided to adopt some from all over the world so that she could create a world free of racism in her own household at least. So she called her adopted family her Rainbow Tribe.
Her heart was in the right place, but the execution was a bit lacking, I would say. Because for one thing, she didn't just adopt a couple of kids, she adopted 12 of them, so she was a bit overwhelmed. She also turned her castle into a kind of anti-racist Disneyland, so her kids were expected to sing and perform for the visitors who bought a ticket and then came to the castle, which I find a bit weird. And also the adoptions put some stress on her marriage, and so soon enough she found herself divorced yet again.
The other love of her life, the country of her birth, was also a complicated story.
I must say it's hard to love someone who doesn't love you back. I did a show about Violet de Cristoforo, who was a Japanese American, and she faced a similar dilemma when the US put her and her family in a concentration camp during World War II.
Josephine Baker had the same kind of love-hate relationship with America. In 1935, after she had made it big in France, she went on a one-year tour of the U.S., and she did not get the reception she was hoping for.
Oh no. I did a bit of digging when researching the show, and here's a 1937 review I found in Time magazine. Quote, Josephine Baker is a St. Louis washerwoman's daughter who stepped out of a Negro burlesque into a life of adulation and luxury in Paris during the booming 20s. In sex appeal to jaded Europeans of the jazz-loving type, a Negro wench always had a head start. But to Manhattan theater goers last week, she was just a slightly buck-toothed young Negro woman whose figure might be matched in any nightclub show and whose dancing and singing might be topped almost anywhere outside of Paris. Unquote.
Ouch, that's rough. Now I know why she thought France was better by comparison.
Well, she went on tour again in the US in 1947 and 1951, and again, she had some mixed results. So remember that Jim Crow laws were still very much on the books throughout the South.
And not just in the South. In 1951, when dining at the Stork Club in NYC, she sat for an hour waiting to be served. She attributed the snub to racism and left in a huff. Walter Winchell, a gossip journalist who was also dining at the Stork that night, thought she was making a big fuss about nothing and accused her of being a communist.
So not just black, but she was also pink or even red, which was a big deal back then. That was right during the McCarthy era. Accusing civil rights activists of being Russian agents, pinkos, that was a pretty common trick in the 50s. Think of J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI.
To be fair, she did embrace some pretty far-left causes. She supported Fidel Castro's rebellion against Batista, and she even spent a short time in prison in Cuba for that. Then when Castro took over, she went to the site of the Bay of Pigs invasion, where she said, "I'm happy to have witnessed the first failure of U.S. imperialism."
Civil rights, that was really her main cause.
Right. She gave a speech during Martin Luther King's March on Washington in 1963, for example.
So we're back to a central theme of her life, how to be accepted as a woman of color in a white-dominated world. For our next musical break, I would like to listen to one of her early songs entitled Si j'étais blanche.
I've never heard of it.
It's not the most famous one, but to me it is the most revealing.
The title means if I were white, right?
You're correct. Yeah, here are some of the lyrics. Quote, as a kid, I was looking sadly at the storefront where they sold blonde dolls. I wanted to look like them. Parisian women were sun tanning at the beach to become black, Meanwhile, I was in the mountains, rolling around in the snow, trying to become white.
Wow, it speaks to the difficulty of having a black skin when whiteness is the standard of beauty.
But then the song finishes on a more different tone, more optimistic. The sun only tans the exterior. Me, my color comes from the fire of my heart. If my face and body are brown, it's because nature made them so. So ask frankly to the men out there, do I really need to be white to seduce you?
That reminds me of some of the Black is Beautiful poems during the Harlem Renaissance.
No big surprise there, actually. Langston Hughes from the Harlem Renaissance, he also spent time in Paris during the 1920s and 30s. So he and Josephine Baker, they met.
We're dropping a lot of famous names today. She knew everybody. But let's listen to the song.
Sure, here is If I Were White, as sung by Josephine Baker.
Étant petite avec chagrin, j'admirais dans le magasin le teinte pâle de poupée blonde. J'aurais voulu le ressembler et j'ai disais l'air accablé, me croyant seul brune au monde. Je voudrais être blanche, pour moi quel bonheur. Si mes seins, mes hanches changent de couleur, les Parisiens à joint le pain se faisaient gloire. Au soleil d'exposer leur rein pour être noir. Moi pour être blanche, j'allais me roulant parmi les avalanches en du Mont Blanc. Ce stratagème d'un Alvéron, j'avais de l'air dans la crème d'un petit pruneau. Que mon bonheur, qui près de vous épanche, garderait sa couleur. Au soleil, c'est par l'extérieur qu'il en se dort. Moi, c'est la flamme de mon cœur qui m'encolore. Et si ma figure, mon corps s'embrunit, c'est parce que la nature me voulait ainsi. Mais je suis franche, dites-moi monsieur, faut-il que je sois blanche pour vous faire mieux?
Bonjour à tous and welcome back to Your Grammar Rocks on KBYS. Je suis Philippe Girard.
And I'm Kealy Trevino. Today we're covering the life of Josephine Baker. Before our break, we saw how she became a leading figure of the civil rights movement of the 1960s, not just in the US, but around the world. She even adopted a large rainbow-colored family in her castle in France.
Unfortunately, that castle turned out to be a money pit. Josephine Baker earned a lot of money, but she spent a lot of money too, and people took advantage of her, including local contractors. By the 1960s, she was broke. She fought and fought to keep her home, but in 1969, she was evicted.
So there she was, in her 60s, with 12 kids, and almost back where she started, poor and homeless.
Thankfully, she still had a trump card up her sleeve.
Are you referring to Grace Kelly?
Yes, I am.
On the surface, the two women couldn't be more different. Grace Kelly was the archetype of the traditional Western standard of beauty.
I will never forget her star turn in the Hitchcock movie, Rear Window. She almost looked too pretty, like a porcelain doll.
She was also an actual princess. She married Prince Rainier of Monaco, but the two women were also both American entertainers living overseas, and they eventually developed a strong bond. Didn't you say that the second show you watched last weekend was about their friendship?
It was. Timisha Harris reprised the role of Josephine Baker, while Rachel Como played Grace Kelly. And it was an interesting play, and one of the scenes was how difficult it was for Grace Kelly, the pretty blonde princess with an elite background, to really understand was Josephine Baker's was up against. And the plight of the 1950s housewife, that was another theme. On the surface, Grace Kelly had the perfect life, but the reality, that was quite different. So despite the age difference, the two women found common ground and they really hit it off.
Do I sense another love affair on the horizon?
Oh no, they were just friends. To begin with, there was a significant age gap. Josephine Baker was much older. And to my knowledge, Grace Kelly was not into women. She just liked rich old men.
Oh, okay. So back to our story. Grace Kelly gave Josephine Baker a place to live with her kids in Monaco after she lost her home in France. She also invited her to star at a big Red Cross gala in Monaco, which relaunched her career yet again. By the 1970s, Josephine Baker was hot stuff again.
Just like Cher and Madonna, a timeless performer whose career just went on and on and on.
Which isn't an easy thing to do for a woman.
Or man, Frank Sinatra also had a big slump in the middle of his career and then went back and became hot again in the 70s. No one wants to listen to the music of their grandparents.
Except when that person's name is Josephine Baker. In 1975, she starred in a major burlesque show in Paris, which was a retrospective of her career.
And that show in the 1975, that was an absolute hit, but also a physical challenge. In case you haven't noticed, she was 68 by then, and she had lived her life to the fullest.
Traveling, performing, loving.
Plus some drugs and alcohol.
So one night after a performance, she suffered a stroke and fell into a coma. She couldn't be revived, and she passed away on April 12th, 1975.
So our story comes to an end.
Almost. Her legacy lives on. You mentioned earlier that she'll soon be honored at the Pantheon in Paris. Maybe you could explain to our listeners what that means?
Well, the Pantheon is like the Arlington Cemetery in the U.S. It's a former church in Paris where heroes of the French Republic are buried and honored. So famous people like Émile Zola and Victor Hugo and Voltaire, they're all there.
So basically all men.
Not anymore. In 1995, the scientist from France and Poland, Marie Curie, she was the first woman to be buried there. And by the way, I did another show about her. So right now there's a big ongoing effort to diversify the kind of people that France chooses to celebrate in public.
Are there any people of color in there now?
Some were also added recently, yes. Two people that I study in Caribbean history, Toussaint Louverture and Louis Delgrès, they are now honored with a plaque there. They gave their life fighting against slavery during the French Revolution. But Josephine Baker will be the first black woman to be honored in the Pantheon. And she was not even born French.
That's amazing. Who would have thought when she was born in St. Louis in 1906 that she would become a star in Paris, date Pablo Picasso and Frida Kahlo, buy her own fairy tale castle, hobnob with Fidel Castro and Charles de Gaulle, and then end up in the Pantheon?
No one would have gambled on that.
What a life. We're glad we could share it with you.
Quelle vie incroyable, en effet.
This program was funded by a Juliet Hartner grant for women in the humanities. Many thanks to our generous donors.
We will leave you with one final song, and this one is about not Josephine Baker, but her friend, Grace Kelly.
I want to talk to you.
The last time we talked, Mr. Smith, you reduced me to tears. I promise you it won't happen again.
Do I attract you? Do I repulse you with my queasy smile? Am I too dirty? Am I too flirty? Do I like what you like? I could be wholesome, I could be loathsome, guess I'm a little bit shy. Why don't you like me? Why don't you like me without making me try? I try to be like Grace Kelly, but all her looks were too sad. So I tried a little Freddie. I've got an entity mind. Tried a little Freddie. I've got an entity mind. I could be brown, I could be blue, I could be light, I could be red, I could be purple, I could be anything
Gotta be clean, gotta be mean.